The brain arrived 3 days before Dr. Silas Covenant did. It came packed in a wooden crate lined with straw, nested inside a leather case, suspended in a jar of alcohol that had leaked during the Atlantic crossing. The express agent in Mercy Falls handled the package gingerly, nose wrinkling at the chemical smell seeping through the wood. He left it at the station rather than delivering it to the boarding house address on the label. Some things a man didn't want in his wagon. Covenant collected it himself on a Thursday morning in October 1873, carrying the crate through streets where mill workers streamed toward the morning shift and shopkeepers swept their stoops. No one asked what he carried. The leather medical bag in his other hand marked him as a physician, and physicians transported all manner of unpleasant necessities. In his rented room on Summit Street, Covenant unwrapped the jar with the care a jeweler might show a diamond. The brain inside was small, shrunken slightly by its months in preserving fluid, but intact. According to his Viennese colleague, it had belonged to a woman who drowned her 3 children in the Danube. Covenant doubted this provenance. Convenient stories always accompanied specimen sales, but the brain itself was genuine, and that was what mattered. He held the jar to the window light, watching amber fluid swirl around gray tissue. Somewhere in those folded structures had lived thoughts, memories, the impulse toward infanticide. If he cut into this tissue, measured it, compared it to normal specimens, would he find the physical marker of madness? The anatomical signature of moral degeneration? He would, he was certain. And this jar was merely practice for the collection he intended to build. A knock interrupted his examination. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Aldrich, calling him to breakfast. Covenant wrapped the jar in velvet, locked it in his trunk, and descended to the dining room where other lodgers were already eating. A railway clerk, a salesman for agricultural equipment, a school teacher named Miss Pruitt, who taught at the Mill Workers' Children's School and who watched Covenant with undisguised curiosity whenever they passed in the hallway. This morning she was bolder. "You're the doctor building the asylum," Miss Pruitt said, spreading jam on toast with precise movements. "The whole town's talking about it." "I hope favorably," Covenant replied. "Mostly, though some wonder if Mercy Falls needs such an institution. We're not Boston." "Mental affliction observes no geographic boundaries, Miss Pruitt. I assure you, every community harbors its share of damaged minds." The schoolteacher's hand paused. Damaged. What an interesting choice of word. Would you prefer diseased? Degenerate? The terminology matters less than the reality. There are people who cannot function in normal society, whose minds have diverged from healthy patterns. They require treatment. Or mercy, Miss Pruitt said quietly. Treatment is mercy. She looked at him then, really looked, and Covenant saw intelligence in her eyes. And something else. Suspicion, perhaps, or wariness. He filed this observation away. Miss Pruitt bore watching. Women with sharp minds often developed problems. Judge Blackwood's invitation arrived that afternoon, delivered by a boy from the telegraph office. Dinner at 7, black tie. The judge wished to discuss the asylum project and introduce Dr. Covenant to other town benefactors. The Blackwood house dominated Summit Street like a blue monument to prosperity. Gas lamps already glowed in the windows when Covenant's hired carriage deposited him at the front steps. A maid in starched black led him past oil paintings of disapproving ancestors to a study where Judge Blackwood waited with 2 other men. Introductions were made. Horace Tillman, who owned 2 of the 3 textile mills. Reverend Samuel Morse from the Congregationalist Church. They settled into leather chairs with brandy, while the judge outlined what Mercy Falls expected from its new asylum. "Discretion," Judge Blackwood said, "is paramount. Families need a place to send troubled relatives without public spectacle, without scandal." "Naturally," Covenant agreed. "The county poorhouse currently keeps 17 lunatics in basement rooms. Conditions are medieval. Several prominent families maintain afflicted relatives at home, hidden away. This cannot continue." Tillman leaned forward, brandy catching lamplight. "My sister's husband has a brother. 34 years old, never worked a day, flies into rages, breaks furniture. They keep him locked in an attic room. The shame of it weighs on the whole family. Our congregation includes at least 4 families struggling with similar burdens, Reverend Morse added. A wife who cannot leave her bed, convinced demons speak to her. A daughter who had to be restrained from throwing herself in the river. A young man who hears the voice of God commanding him to violent acts. These people need proper Christian care. Christian care. Covenant nearly smiled. What they meant was invisible disposal. A place to deposit inconvenient relatives where they would cease to be problems. The asylum I propose, Covenant said, will provide humane, modern treatment based on the latest European medical science. Patients will be housed comfortably, fed adequately, given therapeutic activities. For acute cases, there is hope of improvement. For chronic cases, permanent custodial care in dignified surroundings. And your qualifications? Judge Blackwood's eyes were sharp. Covenant recited his credentials. Medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Additional studies in Vienna and London. Research into the physical origins of mental disease, published in 3 European journals. He did not mention that his research had been terminated at 2 institutions for violating ethical boundaries. I've read your paper on hereditary. I've read your paper on hereditary degeneration, the judge said. Controversial theories. Truth often is. You believe madness passes through bloodlines. I believe susceptibility to mental disease is inherited, yes. Just as susceptibility to consumption or weak constitution passes from parent to child. Certain family lines carry taints that manifest across generations. Reverend Morse shifted uncomfortably. That seems rather deterministic. What of Christian redemption? The possibility of moral improvement? I speak of biology, not theology, Reverend. A man born with weak lungs may pray for strength, but his prayers won't alter his anatomy. Similarly, a mind built on defective architecture cannot achieve stability through faith alone. But surely treatment can help, Tillman asked. In some cases, in others. Covenant paused for effect. In others, the kindest course is simply preventing such defects from propagating to future generations. The room fell silent. Judge Blackwood studied Covenant over his brandy glass, and Covenant knew the judge understood exactly what he meant. The others might flinch from the implication, but Blackwood had spent his career pronouncing judgment. He recognized a man willing to make hard decisions. Dinner was announced. They moved to a dining room where gaslight glinted off crystal and silver. A woman waited there, thin and gray in expensive silk. Catherine Blackwood, the judge's wife. She presided over the meal with automatic grace, speaking little, eyes occasionally drifting toward the ceiling when footsteps sounded from above. The daughter, Covenant thought. The one the judge hadn't yet mentioned but whose presence filled every silence. Halfway through the second course, duck in orange sauce that Covenant barely tasted. A scream pierced the ceiling. Not words, just a raw sound of anguish that made Reverend Morse drop his fork. Catherine Blackwood didn't flinch. She lifted her wine glass with a hand that trembled only slightly. My apologies, Judge Blackwood said. Margaret is having a difficult evening. Another scream, followed by crashes, furniture overturning, glass breaking. Heavy footsteps rushed across the floor above. A woman's voice, firm and commanding, though the words were indistinct. Gradually, the sounds subsided. Your daughter, Covenant said. Not a question. The judge's jaw tightened. Yes. May I ask her diagnosis? 3 different physicians have given 3 different answers. Hysteria, melancholia, moral insanity. The last institution claimed she was possessed by demons and attempted exorcism. His voice dripped contempt. She returned worse than she left. How long has she been afflicted? 11 years, since age 15. She was normal before then. Quiet, obedient, everything a daughter should be. Then something changed. Episodes of uncontrollable excitement followed by weeks of black despair. And the accusations. Catherine Blackwood's wineglass hit the table hard enough to crack. She stood abruptly, excused herself. and left the room. Judge Blackwood watched his wife go, face expressionless. Margaret makes claims about the treatment she's received, about staff at the institutions, about improprieties. Delusions, obviously, but distressing nonetheless. I would like to examine her, Covenant said. Tonight, if convenient. The judge led him upstairs after dinner. 3rd floor, east wing. A uniformed nurse sat in a chair outside a locked door, knitting by lamplight. She stood when they approached. How is she, Mrs. Henshaw? Quieter now, sir. I gave her the laudanum like you said. The judge unlocked the door. The room beyond was large but bare, a hospital room pretending to be a bedroom. Iron bed bolted to the floor. Washstand without mirror. No pictures on the walls, no books, nothing that could be used as a weapon or means of self-harm. Margaret Blackwood sat on the bed in a white nightgown, arms wrapped around her knees. She was 26, but looked younger in the lamplight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. When she raised her eyes to her father, Covenant saw not madness but exhaustion so profound it had its own weight. Margaret, this is Dr. Covenant. He's going to help you. Like the others helped me? Her voice was hoarse from screaming. Like Dr. Morrison, who held me underwater until I stopped fighting? Like the nurses at Bellington who tied me naked to a bed for 3 days? Delusions, Judge Blackwood said to Covenant. But Margaret was looking directly at Covenant now, and her eyes were terribly lucid. You're building the asylum. Everyone knows. A beautiful building where damaged people disappear into beautiful rooms, and no one asks what happens behind locked doors. I provide treatment. You provide disposal. She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Covenant had seen. My father needs me to disappear. My mother is too broken to stop him. And you, doctor, you need patience for whatever it is you're really doing. Covenant felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt. He had trained himself beyond such weakness. But recognition. Margaret Blackwood was not mad. Or rather, her madness was a reasonable response to an intolerable situation. She saw clearly, and that clarity was what her family found intolerable. I'll examine her properly tomorrow, Covenant told the judge. In my office, with appropriate equipment. They left Margaret sitting on her bed, still hugging her knees. As the door locked behind them, Covenant heard her begin to laugh. A sound that was worse than screaming because it was completely sane. The asylum site looked different at night. Judge Blackwood had insisted on showing it to Covenant after dinner, both men slightly drunk on brandy. They stood in the meadow under a hunter's moon while the judge described his vision. A gracious building, gardens, the appearance of a country estate. And the patients who don't improve, Covenant asked, who require permanent custody, will be cared for humanely until natural death. And if natural death could serve a greater purpose, Judge Blackwood turned to him. Explain. Medical science advances through study of the diseased, particularly post-mortem study. The brain of a lunatic examined after death might reveal the physical causes of their affliction, might help us understand how to prevent such conditions in future generations. You want to keep the bodies? Selected cases, those of particular scientific interest, properly preserved, documented. It would be a contribution to medical knowledge. The judge was silent for a long time, breath misting in the cold air. Finally, no one must know. Of course not. Families will expect burial, Christian burial, and will receive it. I'm quite capable of discretion, Judge Blackwood. Another long pause. Then the judge extended his hand. They shook on it there in the moonlit meadow, sealing an agreement that would never be written down, never be spoken of, never be acknowledged. But both men understood perfectly. Construction began in April 1874. Covenant supervised obsessively, particularly the basement. The architect, a Boston man named Hartwell, questioned some of the specifications. Why such extensive underground rooms? Why the sealed chamber with double doors? Why ventilation that could be controlled from inside the room? For violent patients requiring isolation, Covenant explained. Temperature regulation is crucial for managing agitation. Hartwell accepted this. He had designed 2 other asylums and knew physicians had particular requirements. The sealed room was completed first, before the upper floors. Covenant inspected it personally. Stone walls 3 feet thick, sealed drains. Temperature that would remain constant and cool year-round. Shelves already installed along 3 walls, waiting. He stood in that empty room and imagined it filled. Rows of glass jars, each containing a preserved specimen, each labeled with his coded notation. A library of madness rendered physical, available for study by future generations who would recognize his contribution to science. It would be beautiful. While construction continued, Covenant established his practice in Mercy Falls. He took an office above the pharmacy on Main Street, saw patients referred by old Dr. Fletcher, who was increasingly eager to offload difficult cases. One of these was a mill worker named Ezra Whitmore, who came to Covenant's office in July with a problem he could barely articulate. "It's my daughter," Whitmore said, turning his cap in his hands. "Sarah, she's 19. Covenant waited. "She works the mill, same as me, but she's not right. Not normal. She goes to the night school, reads all the time, books, newspapers, political stuff. She went to some suffragist meeting last month, came home talking about women's rights and labor unions. These activities trouble you. Trouble me. They're driving me mad. She argues with everything I say, questions my decisions, refused to marry Tom Brennan, good man, steady foreman, would have taken care of her. Said she wouldn't be owned like property." Whitmore's face reddened. "That's not normal, is it? For a girl to talk that way." "It suggests nervous disorder," Covenant said carefully. "Excessive intellectual stimulation can damage the female constitution. The brain and reproductive organs compete for the same vital energies. When a woman overtaxes her mind, her natural feminine instincts deteriorate. Can you fix her? I can evaluate her. With your permission." Sarah Whitmore arrived at Covenant's office the following week, brought by her father and clearly furious. She was small, dark-haired, with ink stains on her fingers and eyes that assessed everything. When Covenant asked her to sit, she remained standing. "I'm not sick," she said immediately. "Your father believes otherwise. My father believes women should be silent and obedient. I'm neither. That's not illness, Dr. Covenant. That's disagreement. Excessive education in females often produces delusions of competence. I have no delusions. I can read and calculate as well as any man. I understand the labor system that's exploiting us. I understand my father wants me married to his foreman because Brennan promised him a promotion. None of this is madness, it's clarity." Covenant studied her. She was remarkable, actually. Articulate, composed, completely confident in her reasoning. Under different circumstances, he might have admired her intelligence. Under these circumstances, she was a perfect specimen. "Miss Whitmore, do you believe you are smarter than your father?" "In many ways, yes." "Do you believe you understand social and economic systems better than men who have spent their lives studying such matters?" "I believe I understand exploitation when I'm subjected to it." "Do you believe the natural order, men governing, women obeying, is wrong?" "I believe any order that denies half of humanity their rights is not natural but constructed, and what's constructed can be changed." Covenant made notes. Delusions of intellectual equality, rejection of natural hierarchy, inability to accept female subordination, political radicalism. The diagnosis was clear. "Miss Whitmore, you are suffering from moral insanity complicated by intellectual hypertrophy. Your excessive education has damaged your mind's ability to perceive proper social relations. You require treatment." She laughed. Actually laughed. "You're going to lock me up for reading books. I'm going to treat your nervous disorder before it progresses to complete mental collapse. And if I refuse treatment, the law allows fathers to commit adult daughters they deem mentally unfit. Your cooperation is not required." The laughter died. Sarah looked at her father, who wouldn't meet her eyes, then back at Covenant. "How long?" "As long as necessary." "Which means forever." Covenant said nothing. Sarah sat down finally, her composure cracking just slightly. When? The asylum opens in October. You'll be among the first patients. After they left, Covenant added Sarah Whitmore's file to a special drawer in his desk. The drawer contained files for 6 other patients he had marked for particular attention. Not all would become specimens. That decision would take years of observation. But they were all interesting cases, all valuable for research, all potentially useful. The asylum accepted its first 12 patients in October 1875. Margaret Blackwood, Sarah Whitmore, 10 others with diagnoses ranging from melancholia to religious mania. Most were women. Most were young. Most had families who wanted them hidden away. Covenant established strict routines, morning measurements, weekly photography, monthly detailed examinations. He documented everything in coded ledgers that he kept locked in his office safe. The building ran smoothly. Mrs. Carmody, the head nurse, managed the wards efficiently. Patients were kept clean, adequately fed, given simple tasks to prevent idleness. To outside observers, it looked like progressive treatment, humane care, modern medicine. But on the second night after opening, Covenant descended to the basement and stood in the sealed room with its empty shelves. Soon, he thought. Soon the collection would begin. He didn't know he was being watched. Sarah Whitmore had been assigned to a room on the second floor of the West Wing, barred window, locked door. She spent the first days in a fog of grief and rage, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, sitting on her bed staring at the wall. But on the third night, the fog cleared, and Sarah began to pay attention. She noticed Mrs. Carmody's rounds followed a precise schedule. She noticed which doors were kept locked and which weren't. She noticed the asylum had a night orderly, but he spent most of his time dozing in the staff room. And she noticed Dr. Covenant's late-night visits to the basement. The ventilation system connected the building in strange ways. Sounds carried through pipes and ducts. Lying in bed after lights out, Sarah could hear things from other parts of the asylum. Conversations from the nurses' station, the screams of patients having night terrors. And sometimes, late at night, sounds from the basement. Footsteps on stone, doors opening and closing. Once, very faintly, the sound of breaking bone. Sarah sat up in bed, listening hard. The sound came again. Definitely bone. She had heard similar sounds in the mill when workers caught their hands in machinery. Then came water running, the chemical smell that sometimes drifted through the vents. Stronger now, almost overpowering. And finally, just before dawn, the sound of Dr. Covenant's footsteps climbing from the basement. Measured, unhurried, satisfied. Sarah lay back down, her mind racing. What was in the basement? What happened during those late-night visits? Why did some patients disappear from the asylum with explanations that never quite made sense? She thought of Margaret Blackwood, who had warned her the first day. Don't let him get too interested in you. The ones he finds interesting don't last. Sarah had dismissed this as paranoia. Now she wasn't sure. She waited until breakfast to approach Margaret in the common dining room. They sat at a table by the window, out of earshot from the staff. What did you mean? Sarah whispered. About not being interesting? Margaret's eyes were ringed with shadows. The laudanum they gave her every night left her perpetually exhausted. There was a woman, Clara. She had the room next to mine. She died in February. Pneumonia, they said. People die of pneumonia. Do they get buried twice? Margaret leaned closer. I saw them carry her coffin out, but 3 days later, I smelled smoke from the basement vents, smoke that smelled like burning meat, and Dr. Covenant was down there for hours. Sarah's stomach turned. You think? I think Clara is in the basement, part of her anyway. I think whatever Dr. Covenant is building in this asylum, it's not about treatment. Then what? Margaret looked toward the window, toward the gardens and the woods beyond. I think we're specimens. I think he's collecting us. That afternoon, during the hour when patients were allowed to walk in the gardens, Sarah found a spot near the basement windows. They were small, set high in the foundation, covered with iron grates. But through one grate, she could see into the room below. Shelves, glass jars, lamplight reflecting off liquid, and floating in one jar, pale and gray and unmistakable, a human brain. Sarah's vision blurred. She gripped the garden wall to keep from falling. When her sight cleared, she looked again, hoping she'd been mistaken. 3 jars now, 3 specimens, 3 people who had entered this asylum and would never leave, even in death. She walked back to her room on unsteady legs, her mind reformulating everything. This wasn't an asylum. It was a laboratory. And they weren't patients. They were research materials waiting to be harvested. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the asylum's night sounds, waiting for Dr. Covenant's footsteps on the basement stairs. When they came, around 2 in the morning, she got up and pressed her ear to the ventilation grate in her wall. She heard him moving below, heard glass clinking, heard the scratch of pen on paper, making notes, documenting whatever he was doing down there with his collection. And she heard him speak, voice soft, almost tender. "Soon there will be more of you, so many more, and together you'll teach the world what madness really looks like." Sarah sat on her bed, shaking. Margaret was right. They had to get out. But the doors were locked, the windows barred, the staff vigilant, and Dr. Covenant was just beginning his work. How many specimens did he plan to collect? How long before he decided Sarah herself was interesting enough to join those jars in the basement? She thought of the brain she'd seen suspended in alcohol, thought of some future researcher studying it, never knowing it had belonged to a person. A woman who had thoughts and dreams and a name. Clara, the woman who had died in February. No, Sarah corrected herself. The woman who had been killed in February, because that was what this was. Murder disguised as medicine, atrocity disguised as science, and it was just beginning. In his office, Dr. Silas Covenant closed his ledger and locked it in the safe. 3 specimens documented, 9 more patients under observation. The asylum was operating exactly as planned. He stood at his window, looking out over the dark grounds. Somewhere in the woods behind the asylum, an owl called. In the west wing, a patient was crying. Mrs. Hampton, suffering from melancholia following the death of her child. Her grief was profound, treatment-resistant, interesting. Covenant made a mental note to increase his documentation of Mrs. Hampton's case. In 6 months, perhaps a year, he would make a determination about her scientific value. He felt no guilt about this. Guilt was for people who doubted their purpose. Covenant had no such doubts. He was advancing human knowledge. He was documenting the physical reality of mental disease. Future generations would thank him. And if some people had to die to serve that greater purpose, well, they were going to die anyway. Their madness had already stolen their lives. He was simply making sure their deaths meant something. He extinguished his lamp and prepared to go to his rooms. Tomorrow would bring more patients, more examinations, more documentation. The work was endless. But in the basement, in the sealed room with its 3 glass jars, the collection waited, patient and perfect and growing. And Sarah Whitmore, lying awake in her locked room 2 floors above, began planning how to survive long enough to destroy it. The winter of 1875 announced itself with a November ice storm that sheathed Mercy Falls in glass. Trees snapped under the weight. Telegraph wires came down. The mills closed for 3 days when the river froze too solid for the water wheels to turn. Mill workers huddled in their tenements, burning furniture for warmth, and by the time the thaw came in late March, 14 people had died of cold, or the diseases that flourished in overcrowded, underheated rooms. At the asylum, the heating system fought a losing battle against New England winter. Radiators clanked and hissed, but produced barely enough warmth to keep the pipes from freezing. Patients wrapped themselves in thin blankets and pressed close to the radiators until Mrs. Carmody ordered them back to their rooms, concerned about fire hazards. Sarah Whitmore spent her first winter institutionalized learning the asylum's rhythms. She learned that breakfast came at 7 regardless of how little sleep the previous night had allowed. She learned that Mrs. Carmody's rounds followed a precise schedule, varied only by emergencies. She learned which floorboards creaked, which doors were kept locked, which staff members were more observant than others. She learned to appear compliant while remaining alert. Learned to swallow the evening sedatives Mrs. Carmody distributed, then spit them into her wash basin when the nurse moved on to the next room. The medications left other patients dull-eyed and shuffling. Sarah needed her mind sharp. Most importantly, she learned to watch Dr. Covenant. He examined her every week, sometimes more frequently. Measurements with calipers, skull circumference, distance between eyes, width of jaw. Photographs from multiple angles, Sarah standing against a white wall while Covenant adjusted his camera. Questions about her thoughts, her dreams, her opinions on various subjects. He recorded everything in a leather-bound ledger, writing in a cipher Sarah couldn't decode. But she noticed patterns. Covenant examined certain patients more intensively than others. Margaret Blackwood, a young woman named Clara Hewitt, who suffered from profound melancholia. A man on the 3rd floor who heard voices. The attention wasn't random. Covenant was selecting, documenting, preparing. For what? Sarah didn't yet know. But she watched and she waited. And she began to understand that whatever happened in the basement was connected to these examinations. Clara Hewitt died in February. Pneumonia, Mrs. Carmody announced at breakfast. Very sudden. The poor dear had been weak for some time. Dr. Covenant had done everything possible, but her constitution simply couldn't withstand the illness. Sarah had seen Clara the day before her death. The woman had been depressed but not physically ill. No cough, no fever, no signs of respiratory distress. And yet she was dead within 24 hours. The funeral was held quickly. Closed casket, Mrs. Carmody explained, because the disease had been disfiguring. Clara's husband attended alone. Their children were too young to understand. The casket was lowered into frozen ground at the town cemetery while Reverend Morse spoke about God's mercy and eternal rest. Sarah stood at her barred window and watched the funeral procession leave the asylum grounds. Something about it felt wrong. The timing was too convenient. The explanations too smooth. 3 nights after Clara's burial, Sarah woke to sounds from the basement. Her room was directly above one of the basement chambers. Sounds traveled up through the building's ventilation system with strange clarity. Usually she heard only the boiler's rumble or the night orderly's footsteps during his rounds. But tonight she heard different sounds. Footsteps descending the basement stairs. The scrape of metal on stone. Running water. And underneath it all, a smell that drifted through the heating vents, chemical and organic at once, like the preserving fluids she had once seen in a teaching hospital when her night school class had taken an educational tour. Sarah pressed her ear to the ventilation grate in her wall. The sounds continued for hours. Just before dawn, she heard Dr. Covenant's footsteps ascending from the basement, measured and unhurried. She lay awake until morning light filled her room, trying to make sense of what she had heard. The pieces didn't quite fit together yet, but a pattern was emerging. Clara's convenient death, the basement activities, Covenant's intensive documentation of certain patients. He was collecting something, preserving something. But what? The answer came 2 weeks later during a rare moment of carelessness. Sarah had been assigned to help the day orderly, Thomas Pine, carry clean linens from the laundry to the 2nd floor storage closet. Pine was slow-witted and easily distracted. When he stopped to deal with a patient having a tantrum, Sarah continued alone toward the storage closet. She passed Dr. Covenant's office. The door stood slightly ajar, which was unusual. Covenant normally kept it locked. Through the gap, Sarah could see him standing at his desk, his back to the door, examining something. She should have kept walking, should have delivered the linens and returned downstairs. Instead, she set the basket down silently and moved closer to the door. Covenant held a photograph, studying it with intense concentration. Even from her limited angle, Sarah could see it showed a human brain, pale and convoluted, floating in some kind of fluid. Covenant set it aside and picked up another photograph. This one showed the same brain from a different angle. He made notes in his ledger, his handwriting too small for Sarah to read from the doorway. But she saw him reference a label on the photograph's reverse. Subject C.H. Clara Hewitt. C.H. Clara Hewitt. Sarah's vision blurred at the edges. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, and the movement caught Covenant's attention. He turned, saw her standing there, and for a terrible moment their eyes met. His expression didn't change. No guilt, no alarm. Just mild annoyance at being interrupted. Sarah forced words past her constricted throat. "I'm sorry, Dr. Covenant. I was bringing linens. The door was open. I didn't mean to intrude." He studied her for a moment that stretched too long. Then, "In the future, Miss Whitmore, please knock before approaching my office, even if the door appears open. Some of my work requires concentration." "Yes, sir, of course. You may go." Sarah picked up her linens and walked away on legs that barely supported her weight. Behind her, she heard Covenant's door close and lock. That night, she couldn't eat dinner. Couldn't participate in the evening activities Mrs. Carmody organized. She sat in the common room staring at nothing while her mind assembled pieces into a picture so monstrous she wanted to reject it. But the evidence was undeniable. Clara had died suddenly. Covenant had spent hours in the basement the night after her funeral, and now he had photographs of a brain labeled with Clara's initials, which meant Clara hadn't been buried in that casket at the town cemetery, or at least not all of her had been buried. Margaret Blackwood found Sarah in the common room after the other patients had been escorted to their rooms for the night. Margaret had privileges the others didn't. Her father's money and influence bought her slightly more freedom of movement. She sat beside Sarah on the worn sofa and spoke quietly. "You saw something today. In Covenant's office. Your face went white as ash." Sarah looked at this woman who had been institutionalized for 4 years, who had survived by learning to navigate the asylum's dangers. "How much do you know?" "About what he does in the basement. Enough to know Clara isn't resting in peace." Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "There have been others, before you arrived. A man who threw himself from a window. A woman who drowned during hydrotherapy. An old woman from the poorhouse. They all died here. They were all buried quickly. And they were all patients Covenant had been documenting intensively." "You've known this for how long?" "I've suspected for 2 years. But suspecting and knowing are different things, and who would believe me? I'm insane, remember? Delusional. Prone to fantastic accusations." Sarah understood. They were both trapped by their diagnoses. Anything they said would be filtered through the assumption that they were unreliable, that their perceptions couldn't be trusted. "We need proof," Sarah said. "Real evidence. Something that can't be dismissed. The only proof is in the basement, in whatever room Covenant locks himself in at night. And we can't get down there. The doors are locked. Staff watches everything." But Sarah was already thinking about the ventilation system, about the sounds that traveled so clearly from basement to second floor, about the grates that carried air and odor and noise throughout the building. She began planning that night. Not a rushed, desperate attempt, but a careful strategy that would require weeks of observation and preparation. She needed to understand the asylum's routines completely. Needed to identify the moments of maximum distraction when staff attention was focused elsewhere. Needed to find a way to access the basement without being discovered. Most importantly, she needed to survive long enough to execute the plan. Because now that she had seen the photograph, now that she understood what Covenant was doing, Sarah knew she was in immediate danger. She was exactly the type of patient Covenant found most interesting. Young, articulate, diagnosed with a condition that supposedly manifested in brain abnormalities. She was a perfect specimen waiting to be collected. The winter deepened. More patients were admitted. The asylum's population grew to 31 by January. 2 more patients died. An elderly man with dementia, a middle-aged woman who had never spoken during her 3 months of institutionalization. Both deaths were certified as natural. Both bodies were buried quickly, and Covenant's late-night visits to the basement continued. Sarah tracked them in her mind, lacking paper or pencil to make written records. She noted the dates, the duration of his visits, the sounds that carried through the vents. She was building a mental map of his activities, looking for patterns that might reveal vulnerabilities. She also began cultivating relationships with other patients, carefully, selectively, testing who might be trustworthy, who might be willing to take risks if opportunity arose. Margaret was the obvious ally, but there were others. A woman named Anna Cooper, 42, institutionalized by her husband for the crime of inheriting money from her father and refusing to let her husband control it. A young girl named Ruth Davidson, committed by her parents for fornication. She had been raped by her employer's son, had become pregnant, had lost the baby to miscarriage and her reputation to scandal. A woman named Hope Jennings who heard voices but who was also startlingly clear-headed about the asylum's true nature. These women understood they were disposable, understood the asylum wasn't treating them but warehousing them. And they watched Covenant with the same wary attention Sarah did, recognizing a predator when they saw one. But approaching them about coordinated action required extreme caution. The asylum had informants, patients who reported others' behavior in exchange for small privileges. Mrs. Carmody encouraged this, fostered an atmosphere of surveillance and distrust that kept patients isolated from each other. Sarah spent weeks identifying who could be trusted. She tested them with small comments, watching their reactions. Margaret helped, using her longer institutional experience to assess who might be reliable. By March, when winter finally began releasing its grip, Sarah had identified 5 women who understood the danger and might be willing to act. 6, including herself. It wasn't many, but it might be enough. The opportunity came during the spring thaw. The sudden temperature shift created havoc throughout the building. Snow that had accumulated on the roof for months began melting, overwhelming the gutters. Water seeped through the roof in a dozen places. The 3rd floor was worst affected. Puddles formed in the hallways, dripped through ceilings into 2nd-floor rooms. Thomas Pine, the day orderly, was overwhelmed. Water was everywhere. Patients needed to be moved from flooded rooms. Buckets needed to be positioned under leaks. And Pine, never the most capable employee, began making mistakes, forgetting to lock doors, leaving keys in locks, assigning patients to tasks without proper supervision. Mrs. Carmody tried to maintain order, but even she couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. The crisis expanded faster than staff could manage. Sarah volunteered to help with cleanup. So did Margaret and Anna and Hope. Mrs. Carmody, grateful for assistance, assigned them to work under Pine's supervision on the 3rd floor. The hallway was chaos. Water dripping from multiple ceiling leaks. Patients with mops making ineffective attempts at cleanup. Pine shouting contradictory instructions, increasingly frantic as he realized the situation exceeded his capacity to control. Sarah worked near the main staircase, mopping mechanically while her mind calculated timing and opportunity. Pine was distracted. Mrs. Carmody was on the 1st floor dealing with patients frightened by the flooding. The other staff members were scattered throughout the building. She caught Margaret's eye across the hallway. Margaret nodded fractionally. When Pine turned away to deal with a ceiling leak that had suddenly become a pour, Sarah set down her mop and walked to the staircase. Not running. Running would attract attention. Just walking purposefully, as if going to fetch more supplies or report a problem. She descended to the 2nd floor, avoiding the nurses' station by using the servants' stairs at the building's east end. These narrow stairs continued down to the basement, a route Sarah had observed but never used. Staff rarely took these stairs. They were steep and poorly lit, intended for servants and deliveries back when the building had been designed. The basement was significantly colder than the upper floors. The smell that sometimes drifted through the vents was stronger here, concentrated. Chemical preservation mixed with something organic and wrong. Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Just water dripping somewhere and the building's bones settling. The corridor extended both directions. To the left, the boiler room and general storage. To the right, a series of doors and, at the corridor's end, a set of double doors marked private in tarnished brass letters. Sarah moved right, each footstep echoing despite her attempts at silence. Her shoes left wet prints on the stone floor. She would need to eliminate those on the return journey. The first door, medical supplies. Bandages, bottles of chloroform and ether, syringes, instruments. Sarah cataloged the contents quickly, potentially useful later. She moved on. Second door, cleaning supplies. Mops, lye soap, carbolic acid in brown bottles. Third door, locked, but the key hung on a nail beside the frame. Careless security suggesting the room contained nothing immediately valuable. Inside, filing cabinets organized by year. Sarah pulled open the drawer marked 1875 to 1876 and found patient records. She located her own file. The first page was standard documentation, admission date, physical description, family information. But the subsequent pages were filled with Covenant's-coded notations. She couldn't read most of it, but certain elements were clear. Dates of examinations, numerical measurements. And under a section labeled Classification, a single word heavily underlined, Priority. Sarah returned the file with shaking hands. She found Clara Hewitt's file in the same drawer. Similar coded notations, similar classification, Priority. But Clara's file ended with a final entry dated February 14th, 1876, 2 days after her death. The notation was brief, written in clear English rather than code. Specimen acquired. Documentation complete. Subject suitable for preservation. The words were clinical, factual. They transformed Clara's death from tragedy to transaction, from person to material. Sarah forced herself to check other files. The elderly man who had died in January, Priority. The woman who drowned during hydrotherapy, Priority. Every patient who had died at the asylum had received this classification, but there were living patients with the same notation. Margaret Blackwood, Anna Cooper, Ruth Davidson, Hope Jennings, and Sarah Whitmore. They were all marked for collection, all being documented and measured and photographed while they waited for Covenant to decide they were ready for preservation. Sarah closed the cabinet drawer and moved deeper into the basement. The double doors at the corridor's end were secured with a more sophisticated lock than the others. A deadbolt requiring a key Sarah didn't possess. She stood before the doors knowing what lay behind them, knowing she needed to see inside but lacking the means. Then she noticed the ventilation grate. It was set low in the wall beside the doors, larger than the grates in patient rooms, the same system that carried sound so effectively throughout the building. Sarah knelt and examined it. 4 screws held it in place. The screws were loose. Decades of vibration from the building's systems had worked them nearly free. She used a hairpin from her pocket, a technique learned during her mill days when machinery constantly needed minor adjustments. The screws turned easily. The grate lifted away, revealing a square shaft approximately 2 feet across. Sarah looked into the darkness. The shaft extended horizontally for perhaps 6 feet before opening into the sealed room beyond. She could see faint lamplight at the far end. She was small. 14 months of asylum food had made her thinner. She might fit. She removed her shoes and stockings, left them beside the corridor grate, and squeezed into the shaft. The metal was ice against her skin. The space was tighter than anticipated. Her shoulders wedged against the shaft walls. For a terrible moment she was stuck, unable to move forward or back, trapped in a metal coffin where she would suffocate or be discovered or simply die slowly from exposure. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Sarah forced it down through sheer will. She exhaled completely, making herself as narrow as possible, and pushed forward. The shaft scraped skin from her shoulders and hips. She felt blood, warm against the cold metal. 3 feet forward, 4. The distance seemed infinite. Her breathing echoed in the confined space, too loud, surely audible to anyone in the building. Her fingers reached the far grate. She pushed experimentally. It didn't budge. The screws on this side were tighter. Sarah braced her back against the shaft's upper surface and pushed with both hands. Pain shot through her shoulders. Her palms were cut by sharp edges on the grate. One screw loosened slightly, then another. Sarah pushed harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood making her hands slippery. The grate gave way suddenly, falling into the room beyond with a clatter that seemed catastrophically loud in the enclosed space. Sarah tumbled out after it, landing hard on stone floor. She lay there for a long moment, gasping, listening for footsteps that would signal discovery. Silence. Slowly, Sarah stood and looked around. The gallery was larger than she had imagined. Perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above a single oil lamp hanging from a hook. Shelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. The 4th wall held cabinets with wide, flat drawers. And on the shelves, Sarah had thought she was prepared, had thought understanding intellectually what Covenant was doing would cushion the impact of seeing it directly. She was wrong. The top shelf held 7 large glass jars, each containing a human brain suspended in amber fluid. The lamplight made the specimens glow, highlighting every fold and convolution. Each jar was labeled with coded notation: subject CH, subject WC, subject MP, subject ED, people. These had been people: Clara Hewitt, William Chase, Mary Peters, Edward Donovan. Sarah remembered them, had seen them in the common rooms, had exchanged words with some of them, and now they were reduced to specimens in jars, their brains displayed like museum curiosities. But there was so much more. Lower shelves held smaller jars containing tissue samples, organs she couldn't identify, sections of brain displaying particular pathologies. A complete human skeleton stood in the corner, bones wired together with meticulous precision. Opened one and found photographs mounted, opened one, and found photographs mounted on stiff cards. Hundreds of them, organized in folders. She pulled a photograph at random. A woman's face, eyes closed, skin waxy with death. The card's reverse was labeled Subject MH, female, age 34, melancholia, specimen 4, post-mortem photograph, anterior view. Another photograph. A body on a table, chest cavity opened, organs visible. Sarah recognized the face. Thomas Burke, admitted 8 months ago for religious mania. He had disappeared in December. Transferred to another institution, Mrs. Carmody had said. Sarah forced herself to go through the cabinet systematically. She needed to document this mentally. Needed to remember every detail if she ever had the opportunity to report what she had found. The photographs were organized by subject. There were living patients too, series showing the same person over months. Sarah found a folder labeled with her own initials, SW. 6 photographs documented her transformation from defiant admission to increasingly subdued patient. The most recent, taken just last week though she had no memory of it, showed her staring blankly at something beyond the camera's frame. She looked drugged in the photograph. Defeated. Exactly what Covenant wanted her to become. Underneath the photographs, Sarah found ledgers. She opened one and found Covenant's records written in his cipher. Most was indecipherable, but certain elements were clear. Dates, initials, the word harvested appearing frequently. A second ledger contained anatomical drawings. Covenant had significant artistic skill. His sketches of brains were detailed and precise, labeled with measurements and observations. Each drawing was beautiful in its technical execution and horrifying in what it represented. The third ledger was different. This one contained Covenant's theoretical writings in clear English, page after page of dense text explaining his beliefs about hereditary degeneration and the physical manifestations of mental illness. Sarah skimmed the pages, her understanding growing with each paragraph. Covenant believed he was documenting the anatomical signatures of various forms of madness. He theorized that criminal behavior, mental illness, and moral weakness all had physical causes visible in brain structure. He was building evidence that degeneration was hereditary, that certain family lines carried inheritable taints that manifested across generations. The implications were clear. If Covenant could prove his theories, could demonstrate measurable physical differences between normal and degenerate brains, it would provide scientific justification for preventing certain people from reproducing, or from living at all. This wasn't just murder disguised as medical research. It was the foundation for systematic elimination of anyone deemed unfit by arbitrary standards of normalcy. Sarah was replacing the ledger when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Measured, unhurried. Unmistakably Covenant's footsteps. Her body went rigid. The ventilation shaft was 6 feet away. She would never reach it and get inside before Covenant entered. There was nowhere to hide in this room. No closets, no furniture large enough to conceal her, nothing but shelves filled with the dead. The key scraped in the lock. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, into the narrow gap between the door frame and the nearest shelf. When the door opened inward, it would partially conceal her. Barely. If Covenant looked in her direction even casually, he would see her immediately. The door opened. Covenant entered carrying his medical bag and a fresh oil lamp. He moved directly to the center table, set down the lamp, opened his bag. His back was to Sarah, 3 feet away. Close enough that she could hear his breathing, could smell the carbolic soap he used. Covenant removed something from his bag, a jar smaller than the others, containing what appeared to be a section of brain tissue. He carried it to the shelves, found an appropriate space, placed it with precision among the other specimens. Then he stepped back, surveying his collection. The expression on his face was one Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Not cruelty, not sadistic pleasure, just deep satisfaction, pride in work well done. The look of a craftsman admiring his creation. That was worse than malice. Malice could be fought, condemned, understood in simple moral terms. But this clinical satisfaction, this genuine conviction that he was serving a higher purpose, this was more terrifying because it was impervious to moral argument. Covenant walked along the shelves, adjusting the position of jars, straightening labels. He picked up one of the larger specimens, subject C.H., Clara Hewitt, and held it to the light, studying it with the concentration of a jeweler examining a precious stone. Minutes passed. Sarah's legs began trembling from the strain of absolute stillness. A cramp formed in her calf. She fought it silently, knowing even the slightest movement would betray her. Covenant set down Clara's jar and moved toward the photograph cabinets. He was going to walk directly past Sarah's hiding place, was going to see her, was going to... A crash from upstairs, loud enough to penetrate even the sealed room. Then shouting, multiple voices, running footsteps that shook the ceiling. Covenant's head snapped toward the sound. He grabbed his lamp and bag and strode toward the door without looking in Sarah's direction. His mind was already focused on whatever crisis was unfolding above. The door closed. The key turned. Sarah counted to 300 before allowing herself to move. Her legs nearly collapsed. She had to grip the shelf for support, standing among Covenant's specimens while her body shook with reaction. She had been seconds from discovery. Seconds from joining these jars on the shelves, from becoming subject SW, another data point in Covenant's monstrous research. The crisis upstairs, whatever it was, had saved her life. But she was now locked in the gallery with no exit except the ventilation shaft. Sarah forced her trembling body back into the shaft. The return journey was worse than entering. Her scraped shoulders burned against the metal. Blood made her hands slippery. Twice she became wedged and had to work herself free through sheer desperation, terror giving her strength she hadn't known she possessed. But finally, she tumbled back into the basement corridor, replaced the grate with shaking hands, retrieved her shoes. She climbed the servants' stairs on legs that barely functioned. Each step required conscious effort. Her mind kept replaying Covenant's face as he had stood among his specimens, that expression of satisfaction and pride. The third floor was chaos. A patient, Mrs. Eldridge, an elderly woman with dementia, had fallen on the wet floor, struck her head on the radiator. Blood pooled around her. Thomas Pine was attempting first aid with inadequate supplies, his hands shaking. Mrs. Carmody had arrived and was shouting for Dr. Covenant. Sarah joined the other patients crowding the hallway, anonymous in the confusion. No one noticed her wet footprints. No one questioned where she had been. She was just another patient, another body to be managed. Mrs. Eldridge died 4 hours later. Covenant certified the death as accidental. Patient fell during maintenance crisis. Head trauma. Couldn't be saved despite immediate intervention. Sarah watched them carry the body away and knew that Mrs. Eldridge hadn't been on Covenant's priority list, hadn't been marked for collection. Her death was genuinely accidental. But Sarah also knew that Covenant wouldn't waste the opportunity. Mrs. Eldridge's brain would still end up in a jar, would still be measured and photographed and added to the collection. Accidental deaths were as useful for his research as deliberate ones. That night, lying in her locked room, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gallery, saw the jars, saw Covenant's satisfied expression. But beneath the horror, her mind was working. She had seen the collection, had documented it mentally in as much detail as memory would allow. She knew what Covenant was doing, knew the scope of it, knew how systematic and deliberate his murders were. But knowing wasn't enough. She needed to destroy the collection, needed to burn Covenant's ledgers and smash his specimens and eliminate the evidence of his crimes. And she needed to escape before she joined the jars on the basement shelves. The problem was that she couldn't do either thing alone. One person couldn't destroy the gallery thoroughly enough, couldn't create a fire intense enough to consume everything without being discovered immediately. And one person escaping would be caught within hours. But 6 people working together, that might be possible. Sarah began refining the plan she had been developing for weeks. It would require perfect timing, would require every one of them understanding their role and executing it flawlessly, would require accepting that they might not all survive. But the alternative was waiting passively to be murdered and preserved, to become specimens in Covenant's gallery of the damned. Over the following days, Sarah approached the others. Margaret first, then Anna, then Hope, then Ruth. Conversations had to be brief and oblique, conducted during moments when staff attention was focused elsewhere. She told them what she had seen in the basement, described the jars, the photographs, the ledgers, watched their faces process the information, watched horror and rage and grim determination replace whatever hope they had been clinging to. Margaret had tears streaming down her face by the time Sarah finished. "We're all going to die here." "Not if we act first," Sarah said. "How? The doors are locked, the windows are barred, there are staff everywhere. We create a crisis large enough that staff can't contain it. Use the chaos to get to the basement, destroy the collection, and get out before they can stop us." "That's insane!" "Yes," Sarah agreed, "which is why it might actually work. They think we're broken, they think we're passive, they don't expect us to fight back." Anna Cooper spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What kind of crisis?" "Fire," Sarah said. "Controlled enough that we can escape, large enough that it destroys the basement gallery and everything in it." "People could die," Hope said quietly. "Other patients, staff who've done nothing wrong." "People are already dying," Sarah replied. "We're dying, and Covenant will keep killing until someone stops him." Ruth Davidson, the youngest of them at 17, looked around at the others. "I'm not dying in here. I'm not letting him turn me into one of those things in jars. If we have even a chance of getting out, I'm taking it." The others nodded one by one. Margaret last, wiping tears from her face with shaking hands. "When?" "Soon," Sarah said. "We need one more person, someone from the staff, someone who knows what Covenant is doing and is willing to help us." "No staff member will believe us," Anna said. "They'll think we're delusional." "Not if they see the evidence themselves." Sarah had been watching the asylum's newest nurse, a young woman named Elizabeth Morse who had arrived in April. Elizabeth was different from Mrs. Carmody and the other staff. She looked at patients as if they were people rather than problems to be managed. She asked questions about their treatment that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with Covenant's methods. And Sarah had seen Elizabeth's face during a hydrotherapy treatment last week, had seen her discomfort as Covenant held a patient underwater longer than seemed therapeutic, had seen something in Elizabeth's expression that looked like doubt. The opportunity to approach Elizabeth came in May. Sarah was in the medication room, supposedly helping to organize the evening doses while Pine dealt with a disturbance in the common room. Elizabeth was alone, counting pills into small paper cups. Sarah moved to stand beside her, speaking quietly. "You know something's wrong here." Elizabeth's hands paused over the medication. "Excuse me?" "With the treatments, with the deaths, with what Dr. Covenant does in the basement, you know something's wrong. That's an inappropriate... You saw him with Ruth Davidson yesterday, saw him hold her under the water, saw that it wasn't treatment." Elizabeth's face had gone pale. "Miss Whitmore, you should return to your room." "He killed her," Sarah said. "Just like he's killed 11 others since this asylum opened. And he's going to keep killing until someone stops him. That's a serious accusation. You're not well. Your diagnosis..." "My diagnosis is that I read books and questioned my father's authority. That's not illness, Miss Morse. That's inconvenience. Just like half the women in this building aren't sick, we're just unwanted." Elizabeth was gripping the medication counter, knuckles white. "Even if what you're saying were true, what could I possibly do?" "You could look," Sarah said. "You could see what's in the basement, and then you could decide whether you want to be complicit in murder." For a long moment, Elizabeth said nothing. Then, very quietly, "How would I see?" "Tonight," Sarah said. "After the patients are locked in their rooms, I'll show you how to get into the gallery. And then you can decide whether I'm delusional or whether this asylum is exactly what I'm telling you it is." Elizabeth looked at Sarah, really looked, and Sarah saw the moment of decision in her eyes. "If you're lying, I'm not lying, and you already know that. You've just been trying not to see it." That night, after the asylum had settled into its evening routine, Sarah waited by her door. The lock was simple, another skill learned during her mill days when she had sometimes needed to access supply rooms without authorization. She had been practicing for months with a thin piece of metal salvaged from a broken comb. The lock gave with a soft click. Sarah slipped into the hallway. Elizabeth was waiting near the servants' stairs, her face pale in the dim gaslight. She didn't speak, just followed as Sarah led her down to the basement. The corridor was dark and cold. Sarah moved from memory to the filing room, retrieved Clara Hewitt's file, showed Elizabeth the final entry. Specimen acquired. Documentation complete. Subject suitable for preservation. "This doesn't prove..." Elizabeth began. "The gallery is down the hall," Sarah said. "I can't get you inside. The doors are locked. But I can get you close enough to look through the ventilation shaft." She led Elizabeth to the double doors, removed the corridor grate, gestured to the shaft. "Look for yourself." Elizabeth hesitated, then knelt and peered into the shaft. Sarah watched her face in the lamplight, watched confusion become comprehension, become horror, watched Elizabeth's hand fly to her mouth as she saw the jars on the shelves, the preserved brains floating in their amber fluid, the evidence of systematic murder displayed like a museum exhibition. Elizabeth pulled back from the shaft, stumbled to her feet. For a moment, Sarah thought she might vomit. Then Elizabeth's nurse training reasserted itself, imposing professional composure over visceral reaction. "How many?" Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. 7 complete specimens, tissue samples from at least 15 others. He's been doing this since the asylum opened, and he's marked 6 of us as priority subjects. We're next." Elizabeth's hands were shaking. "We have to report this. The sheriff, the county medical board, someone. Who will believe us? I'm diagnosed with moral insanity. The other patients are hysterics and melancholics. Covenant is a respected physician. His word against ours." Sarah stepped closer. The only way to stop him is to destroy the evidence and escape before he can kill anyone else. Destroy evidence? You're talking about arson, about breaking out of a legal institution. I could lose my license, be arrested. You could also be the reason 6 women survive, or you could do nothing and be the reason we die. Elizabeth closed her eyes. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing across her face. Training and professional ethics warred with moral horror and human decency. Finally, Elizabeth opened her eyes. "What do you need me to do?" Relief flooded through Sarah, almost buckling her knees. "Help us create a distraction large enough that staff can't contain it. Help us get to the basement and get out of the building before it burns." "When?" 3 days, Sunday night. The staff is always reduced on Sundays. It's our best chance. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Sunday night. God help us all. They returned to the upper floors separately, Sarah slipping back into her room, Elizabeth continuing her rounds as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They had an ally. They had a plan. And in 3 days, the Mercy Falls Asylum would burn. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about all the ways this could fail. Tried not to imagine being caught, being locked in the gallery, joining the specimens on the shelves. Instead, she thought about Clara Hewitt, about William Chase, about all the people whose brains floated in jars in the basement, who would never receive proper burial, who would never be mourned as people rather than research materials. 3 more days, she promised them silently. 3 more days, and Covenant's collection would be destroyed. His work would burn. And maybe, somehow, the 6 women he had marked for death would survive to tell the truth about what had happened in this place. It wasn't justice. It wasn't enough. But it was all they had. In his office, Dr. Silas Covenant sat at his desk reviewing his research notes. His collection had grown to 7 complete specimens with tissue samples from 18 additional subjects. The data was compelling. He was beginning to see patterns in brain structure that correlated with specific behavioral abnormalities. Within a year, perhaps 2, he would have enough specimens to publish his findings, to present his research to the medical community, to prove that mental degeneration had physical manifestations that could be identified, measured, prevented. His legacy was taking shape. Future generations would recognize his contribution to scientific knowledge, would understand that he had advanced human understanding through careful documentation and preservation. He felt no guilt about the methods. The subjects he had harvested were already lost to madness. Their deaths had meaning now, purpose. Their brains would teach the world lessons they could never have taught in life. Covenant closed his ledger and locked it in the safe. Tomorrow he would examine 3 patients who were approaching readiness for collection. The weekend after that, he would add at least 1 new specimen to the gallery. The work was progressing exactly as planned. He had no idea that in 3 days, everything he had built would be ashes. Sunday came wrapped in unseasonable heat that made the asylum's thick brick walls trap warmth like an oven. By mid-afternoon, the temperature inside had climbed above 90 degrees. Patients wilted in the common rooms, fanning themselves with whatever they could find. Mrs. Carmody allowed windows to be opened despite the bars, desperate for any circulation of air. The heat was a gift Sarah hadn't anticipated. Staff moved more slowly in the oppressive temperature. Attention wandered. The evening orderly, a man named Robert Finch, who worked Sundays, spent more time outside smoking than making his rounds. Even Mrs. Carmody, normally rigorous in her supervision, retreated to her small office where a cross breeze from 2 windows made the heat marginally more bearable. Sarah had spent the 3 days since recruiting Elizabeth in a state of controlled terror. Every moment felt precarious. Every interaction with Covenant carried the weight of her secret knowledge. She was certain he would see through her facade of compliance, would recognize that she knew about the gallery, would accelerate her timeline for collection. But Covenant noticed nothing. He examined her on Friday with his usual methodical thoroughness, measurements with calipers, notes in his ledger, questions about her mental state that Sarah answered with careful blandness. She was feeling more settled, she told him. The asylum routine was helping. She was beginning to understand that her previous thoughts had been disordered. Covenant nodded, satisfied. He made a notation Sarah couldn't read, then dismissed her. As she left his office, Sarah glimpsed the page. A single word in clear English rather than cipher, ready. She had perhaps a week before Covenant decided to harvest her, maybe less. The plan they had developed was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. Elizabeth would create an initial disturbance on the first floor, a medical emergency requiring immediate staff attention. While Mrs. Carmody and Finch were occupied, the 6 patients would move to the basement through the servants' stairs. Sarah would lead them to the gallery. They would use the lamp oil stored in the supply closet to accelerate the fire. Elizabeth would release the other patients from their locked rooms, giving everyone a chance to escape the burning building. The fire would destroy Covenant's collection, his ledgers, his specimens. The chaos would allow the 6 to slip away in the confusion. They would scatter. Trying to stay together would make them easier to track. Each woman had a destination planned. Sarah intended to reach Boston, lose herself in the city's anonymity, find work in one of the garment factories where questions weren't asked. But everything depended on timing. If staff discovered them too soon, they would be locked in their rooms with no chance of escape. If the fire spread too quickly, they might be trapped in the basement. If even one element failed, the entire plan collapsed. Margaret had spent the previous evening unpicking the hem of her dress, removing the 11 tears she had made to mark the disappeared patients. When Sarah asked why, Margaret's smile was sad and strange. "If we don't make it out, I don't want those tears to burn with me. I want them to mean something." She had saved the threads, twisted them together into a single strand, and tied it around her wrist like a bracelet. 11 knots for 11 dead. A physical reminder of what they were fighting against. Ruth Davidson had written a letter to her parents. Not an accusation. She knew they wouldn't believe her. Just a simple statement. "I'm sorry for disappointing you. I hope you can forgive me someday." She had given the letter to Elizabeth to mail if Ruth didn't survive. Elizabeth had accepted it silently, her face unreadable. Anna Cooper had spent her time in prayer, though Sarah wasn't sure who Anna thought was listening. Hope Jennings had been quiet, withdrawn into herself in a way that worried Sarah. Hope's voices had been getting worse. The stress of planning, the weight of anticipation, seemed to be destabilizing her already fragile mental state. Sarah had tried to reassure her, but Hope had just looked at her with eyes that saw things Sarah couldn't. "The ones in the jars are screaming," Hope said. "Can't you hear them? They want us to burn it all down. They want to stop screaming." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. She just gripped Hope's hand and promised it would be over soon. The 6th member of their group was a woman named Catherine Mills, 46 years old, institutionalized by her son after she had tried to prevent him from committing her mother, his grandmother, to the county poorhouse. Catherine had fought her commitment legally for 8 months before the courts ruled against her. She had been at the asylum for 6 months, marked as priority for 3. Catherine was practical, calm, and utterly without illusions about their chances. "Most of us won't make it out," she had said when Sarah outlined the plan. "You understand that, right? This isn't a rescue. It's revenge with a possibility of survival." Sarah understood. They all did. But even a slim possibility was better than the certainty of ending up in Covenant's gallery. Sunday evening brought the routine Sarah had memorized over 15 months of institutionalization. Dinner at 6, bland food eaten in the common dining room under staff supervision. Recreation hour from 7 to 8, patients reading approved books, playing simple games, sitting in listless groups. Medications distributed at 8:15. Mrs. Carmody moving from patient to patient with her tray of pills and tonics. Patients escorted to their rooms at 8:30. Doors locked at 9. Lights out at 9:15. Sarah palmed her medication as usual, the pills hidden under her tongue until she could spit them into her wash basin. The others did the same. Elizabeth had warned them they would need full mental clarity tonight. Through her door, Sarah heard Mrs. Carmody's footsteps retreating down the hallway, heard the squeak of the nurse's office door, the scrape of a chair. Mrs. Carmody would remain in her office until 10, completing paperwork. Finch would be outside smoking or dozing in the staff room, making desultory rounds at irregular intervals. Sunday nights were the quietest time in the asylum's weekly schedule, the perfect time for what they were planning. Sarah counted to 1,000, then used her makeshift lockpick on the door. The mechanism gave with a click that sounded catastrophic in the silence but went unnoticed. She slipped into the hallway. Margaret emerged from the next room. Then Anna. Then Ruth, Catherine, and Hope. They moved toward the servants' stairs in single file, barefoot to minimize sound, each carrying something useful. Margaret had a blanket to smother flames if necessary. Ruth had a candle and matches from the common room. Catherine carried a Bible, not from religious conviction, but because the heavy book could be used as a weapon if needed. The servants' stairs were dark and steep. Sarah descended first, one hand on the wall for balance, testing each step before committing her weight. Behind her, the others followed with painful slowness. They reached the basement without incident. The corridor was dark except for a single gas lamp turned low. Sarah led them to the supply closet where lamp oil was stored in large ceramic jugs. Catherine and Anna began carrying jugs toward the gallery while Sarah worked on the ventilation grate. Her hands were shaking, making the work harder. The screws that had turned so easily 3 days ago now seemed fused in place. Behind her, Margaret whispered urgently, "Someone's coming." Footsteps on the stairs, not running but purposeful. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Elizabeth appeared at the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard. "Mrs. Carmody is asking questions. She knows something's wrong. We need to move faster. The grate won't—" Sarah's hand slipped, dropping the makeshift screwdriver. "Let me." Catherine pushed Sarah aside, gripped the grate with both hands, and pulled. The old metal bent, screws popping free with small explosive sounds. The grate came away completely. Sarah crawled into the ventilation shaft for the third time, her body protesting the familiar scrape of metal against bruised skin. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her came Margaret, then Hope, then the others, all squeezing into the narrow space. The far grate gave way more easily. Sarah had loosened it during her previous visit. She tumbled into the gallery, and the others followed. For a moment, they all stood frozen, staring at the shelves of specimens. Even knowing what to expect, seeing the jars with their preserved brains, the skulls, the photographs, the skeleton in the corner, it was overwhelming. Hope made a sound like a wounded animal. Ruth was crying silently. Catherine's face had gone rigid with fury. "Do it," Margaret said. "Burn it all." They moved quickly, pouring lamp oil over the shelves, the cabinets, the table where Covenant did his dissections. The oil splashed across jars and photographs and ledgers. The chemical smell mixed with the preservative fluids already permeating the room, creating a nauseating combination. Sarah found Covenant's master ledgers, the ones containing his theoretical writings and coded records. She wanted to take them, to preserve evidence, but there was no time and they were too bulky to carry. Instead, she soaked them thoroughly in lamp oil, watching the leather bindings darken as they absorbed the fluid. Anna was smashing jars methodically, using a metal instrument from Covenant's dissection kit. Brains spilled onto oil-soaked shelves, gray tissue mixing with broken glass and amber fluid. Subject CH, subject WC, subject MP. The people they had been were finally being released from their glass prisons, even if the release was into fire and destruction. Catherine had found the photograph cabinets and was emptying them, spreading hundreds of images across the oil-slicked floor. The faces of the dead stared up at them, frozen in their final moments. "Enough," Elizabeth called from the doorway. "We need to go, now." Ruth struck a match. The flame seemed impossibly small and fragile. She touched it to an oil-soaked ledger. The fire caught instantly. It spread across the ledger's pages with a whoosh of displaced air, then jumped to the next ledger, the next, racing across the oil-soaked surfaces faster than Sarah had anticipated. Within seconds, the shelves were ablaze. The heat was immediate and intense. They ran back through the ventilation shaft, crawling frantically while behind them the fire roared. Sarah's dress caught on a sharp edge and tore. Margaret's hands were bleeding from broken glass, but they kept moving, driven by terror and the knowledge that the fire was spreading faster than planned. They tumbled into the basement corridor just as smoke began pouring from the gallery's double doors. The heat had warped the wood, broken the locks. Flames were visible through the gaps. "Upstairs!" Elizabeth shouted. "Get everyone out!" But the fire had already reached the wooden stairs at the corridor's end, the route Covenant used to access the gallery. Flames climbed the dry wood with terrifying speed, reaching toward the first floor. Sarah ran for the servants' stairs with the others behind her. Smoke was filling the basement, thick and acrid. Hope stumbled, fell. Catherine hauled her up bodily, half-carried her up the stairs. The first floor was chaos. The fire alarm, a bell that could be rung manually, was clanging. Patients were emerging from rooms, confused and frightened. Elizabeth was moving through the hallways, unlocking doors, releasing everyone she could reach. Mrs. Carmody appeared, her face shocked and furious. She grabbed Elizabeth's arm. "What have you done?" "Saving them," Elizabeth said, and pushed past her toward the next locked door. Finch was trying to organize an evacuation, but he was overwhelmed. 43 patients, many of them disoriented or actively resisting, needed to be moved out of a burning building. Smoke was rising through the floorboards, seeping through ventilation grates. Sarah grabbed patients as she passed them, pushing them toward the main entrance. "Out! Everyone out! The building's on fire!" Some moved. Others stood frozen, unable to process the emergency. Sarah saw a young woman, barely 20, admitted last month for melancholia, standing in her doorway, staring at the smoke beginning to fill the hallway. Sarah took her hand. "Come with me. We're leaving." The woman followed like a child. The main entrance was blocked by Finch, who was trying to maintain order, to get an accurate count of patients, to prevent a stampede. Sarah pushed past him into the night air. The heat inside the building had been oppressive. Outside was barely cooler, but at least the air was breathable. Sarah gulped it in, her lungs burning from smoke inhalation. Behind her, patients streamed out of the building. Some were crying, others looked dazed. A few were laughing with an edge of hysteria. Mrs. Carmody was trying to maintain control, shouting orders that no one followed. Sarah looked for the others, found Margaret helping an elderly patient down the front steps, Ruth and Anna supporting a woman between them, Catherine carrying a child, the 8-year-old daughter of a patient, admitted with her mother, both diagnosed with hereditary madness. Elizabeth was still inside. Sarah started back toward the building, but Margaret caught her arm. "You can't! Look!" Flames were visible in the first-floor windows now. Elizabeth emerged through the smoke, coughing violently, supporting an elderly man who could barely walk. She got him down the steps, then collapsed on the grass, gasping. Sarah knelt beside her. "Is everyone out?" Elizabeth shook her head, still coughing too hard to speak. "How many?" Sarah's voice was raw. Elizabeth held up fingers. Three patients still inside. Sarah looked at the burning building. The first floor was fully involved now. The second-floor windows were beginning to glow. No one could survive in there. "Who?" But even as she asked, Sarah knew. The patients on the third floor, the men's ward, the ones furthest from the exit. They had been locked in. Elizabeth hadn't reached them in time. A window on the second floor shattered from the heat. Flames licked out hungrily. Someone was screaming. Sarah realized it was Mrs. Carmody, standing in front of the burning building, screaming for someone to do something, to save the building, to save Dr. Covenant's work. Covenant. Sarah scanned the crowd of patients and staff gathered on the lawn. She didn't see him. He wasn't here. "Where's Covenant?" she asked Finch, who was standing nearby looking shell-shocked. "In town. Dinner with Judge Blackwood. Due back at 10. Relief and disappointment warred in Sarah's chest. Covenant wasn't in the building. He would survive. But he also wasn't here to see his life's work burning. The sound of the fire was enormous now. Not just crackling, but roaring, a living thing consuming everything it touched. The second floor was fully involved. The third floor windows were beginning to smoke. In the distance, a bell began ringing. The town fire brigade, finally alerted. But the asylum was 2 miles from town, and the brigade was volunteer, and by the time they arrived, there would be nothing left to save. Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. Margaret, her face illuminated by the burning building. "We need to go, while everyone's distracted." She was right. In the chaos, in the smoke and confusion and tragedy, the 6 of them could slip away, could disappear before anyone thought to take an accurate count of who had escaped. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at the burning building, at the windows where 3 men were dying because the fire had spread too fast, because they had been locked on the 3rd floor, because Sarah and the others had started this fire without fully understanding what they were unleashing. They had wanted to destroy Covenant's collection, had wanted to burn the evidence of his crimes. But they had also killed 3 people who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when the fire started. Sarah felt the weight of those deaths settling on her shoulders, felt the moral complexity of what they had done, necessary and monstrous at once. "Sarah," Margaret's voice was urgent. "We have to go, now." The others were already moving, slipping away from the crowd, heading toward the tree line beyond the asylum grounds. Sarah took one last look at the burning building, at the life she was leaving behind, at the evidence of Covenant's crimes turning to ash. Then she ran. They moved through darkness, guided by moonlight and desperation, away from the asylum, away from the fire, into the woods that bordered the property. Behind them, the roar of flames gradually faded, replaced by night sounds, insects, wind in leaves, the distant barking of dogs. No one spoke. They were saving their breath for running, for putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the asylum before someone organized a pursuit. Sarah's lungs burned. Her feet, bare and unprotected, were cut by rocks and roots. But she kept moving, driven by terror of what would happen if they were caught. After perhaps 30 minutes, Catherine stopped, leaning against a tree and gasping. "We need to split up. Harder to track." She was right. But the thought of separating, of losing these women who had become something like family in their shared desperation, made Sarah's chest constrict. "Where will you go?" Ruth asked, her young voice small in the darkness. "West," Catherine said. "I have a cousin in Ohio. She'll help me." "Anna, my sister, is in Providence. If I can reach her—" Hope said nothing, just stared at the trees with that distant expression that meant she was listening to voices no one else could hear. Margaret looked at Sarah. "Boston?" "Boston," Sarah confirmed. "There's work in the garment factories. They don't ask questions." "Then we go in pairs," Catherine decided. "Less suspicious than 6 women traveling together. Less vulnerable than going alone." They divided quickly, Catherine and Hope together. Hope needed someone practical to keep her grounded. Anna and Ruth, the 2 who seemed most fragile, supporting each other. Sarah and Margaret, the ones who had started this, who carried the deepest knowledge of what they were fleeing. Brief embraces, whispered wishes for luck and safety. Then they separated, moving in different directions into the darkness. Sarah and Margaret headed east, toward the road that would eventually lead to Boston. They walked through the night, avoiding the main road, moving through fields and woods parallel to it. When dawn came, they hid in a barn and slept in fitful shifts, taking turns watching for pursuers. They woke to the sound of church bells, Sunday morning service in some nearby town. Sarah's body ached from the night's exertion. Her feet were bloody and swollen. Margaret looked worse, her face gray with exhaustion. But they were alive. They were free. And, behind them, Covenant's collection was ashes. They reached the outskirts of Boston 3 days later. The journey had been brutal. They had walked mostly at night, hiding during the day in barns and sheds and once in an abandoned cabin. They had stolen food from farms. Sarah felt guilt about that, but hunger had overridden conscience. Margaret's condition had deteriorated steadily. 4 years of institutionalization and heavy medication had left her physically weakened. By the second night, she was coughing blood. Sarah found them shelter in a boarding house in Boston's South End, a neighborhood where questions weren't asked, and lodgers paid by the week. The landlady, a tired woman who had seen too much of life to be shocked by 2 bedraggled women with no luggage, accepted Sarah's story about fleeing an abusive husband. Margaret lasted 2 more weeks. The cough worsened despite Sarah's attempts at nursing. Fever set in. On a rainy Tuesday in June, Margaret died in the narrow boarding house bed, Sarah holding her hand. "Did we do the right thing?" Margaret whispered near the end, her voice barely audible. Sarah didn't know how to answer. 3 men had died in the fire. The asylum had burned to the ground. Covenant's collection was destroyed, but so was any evidence of his crimes. Who would believe Sarah's story now? Who would accept that a respected physician had been systematically murdering patients without the physical proof that no longer existed? "We survived," Sarah said finally. "That has to be enough." Margaret smiled slightly. "The ones in the jars can rest now. At least there's that." She died an hour later. Sarah buried her in a pauper's grave at the city cemetery, using the last of the money she had stolen during their flight. No headstone, no marker. Just 1 more anonymous body and 1 more anonymous grave. But Sarah kept the bracelet Margaret had made from her dress hem. 11 knots for 11 dead. She wore it under her sleeve, a reminder of why she had survived when so many hadn't. Finding work was easier than expected. The garment factories were always hiring. The work was brutal but steady, and the 4 women didn't care about workers' pasts as long as they could sew straight seams and meet quotas. Sarah took a room in a tenement, shared with 3 other factory girls. She adopted a new name. Mary Sullivan, Irish immigrant, arrived 2 years ago. Parents dead of fever. The story was common enough that no one questioned it. She worked 12-hour days at a sewing machine, her hands becoming calloused, her eyes strained from close work in poor light. At night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to the other girls breathe and thought about the asylum, the fire, the women who had scattered into the night. She wondered if they had survived, if Catherine had reached Ohio, if Anna had found her sister in Providence, if Ruth was alive somewhere, building a new life, if Hope's voices had quieted, or if they had driven her deeper into madness. Sarah would never know. They had agreed not to contact each other, not to create any trail that might connect them back to the asylum fire. Their survival depended on remaining separate and anonymous. But sometimes Sarah imagined them out there somewhere, living under assumed names, working in factories or as domestic servants, carrying the same weight of memory and guilt and trauma that she carried. They were survivors, all of them. But survival had a cost that no one who hadn't paid it could understand. News of the asylum fire reached Boston within a week, reported in the newspapers as a tragic accident. Sarah read the article in the boarding house common room, her hands shaking. Mercy Falls Asylum. Destroyed by fire, 3 dead, dozens displaced. The article described the blaze as having started in the basement, possibly from a fault in the heating system or a carelessly stored lamp. Dr. Silas Covenant, the asylum's medical director, expressed profound grief at the loss of life and the destruction of years of important medical research. The 3 men who died, patients on the 3rd floor who couldn't be reached in time, were named. Sarah committed their names to memory. Thomas Burke, James Patterson, Edward Morrison. 3 more deaths she bore responsibility for. Most patients had been successfully evacuated. The article continued. They were being temporarily housed at the county poorhouse while arrangements were made for their care. Dr. Covenant planned to rebuild the asylum, was already soliciting donations for a new facility. The final paragraph made Sarah's blood run cold. Authorities are seeking information on 6 female patients who have not been accounted for since the fire. The women, all diagnosed with various mental afflictions, may be confused and in need of immediate medical attention. Anyone with information on their whereabouts should contact Sheriff Morton in Mercy Falls. 6 women: Sarah, Margaret, Anna, Ruth, Catherine, Hope. But Margaret was dead, buried in a Boston pauper's grave. So 5 remained at large. Sarah burned the newspaper in the boarding house stove, watching the article curl and blacken, consuming the names and descriptions that might identify her. She became more careful after that, avoided newspapers, kept her head down at the factory, spoke to the other workers only when necessary. She was Mary Sullivan, anonymous and unremarkable, just another immigrant girl working to survive. Months passed. Summer heat gave way to autumn chill. Sarah's body adapted to the factory work, her hands developing the speed and precision that earned slightly higher wages. She saved every penny she could, knowing that survival meant having resources, meant being able to move quickly if she was ever discovered. The nightmares were constant. Sarah dreamed of the gallery, of jars filled with brains, of Covenant's satisfied expression as he studied his specimens. She dreamed of the fire, of flames consuming everything, of 3 men screaming behind locked doors. She dreamed of Margaret dying in the boarding house bed, asking if they had done the right thing. Sarah never had an answer. In November, 7 months after the fire, a woman approached Sarah on the street outside the factory. She was well-dressed, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a careful smile. "Excuse me, miss, I'm looking for someone. A young woman who used to work at a hospital in western Massachusetts. I wonder if you might know her." Every instinct screamed danger. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry, I don't know anyone from Massachusetts. I'm from New York originally." "Of course, my apologies." The woman started to turn away, then paused. "Though you do look remarkably like a photograph I have. A young woman named Sarah Whitmore. Diagnosed with moral insanity, though between you and me, I suspect she was perfectly sane and simply inconvenient to her family." Sarah's heart stopped. She prepared to run, but the woman's next words froze her in place. "My name is Dr. Harriet Webster. I'm a physician in Boston, specializing in women's health and nervous disorders. I've spent the past 6 months investigating Dr. Silas Covenant and the Mercy Falls Asylum. I believe you can help me prove he's a murderer." Sarah stared at her. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, I know who you are. I know you were at the asylum. I know you started the fire that destroyed Covenant's collection." Dr. Webster's voice was gentle but firm. "I also know you were right to do it. If you know so much, why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "Because the authorities won't listen. Not without evidence, not without testimony from someone who was there." Dr. Webster stepped closer. "Covenant is rebuilding. He's soliciting donations from wealthy families. He's already secured commitments for a new facility twice the size of the old one. If we don't stop him now, he'll continue his work. More patients will die. More bodies will be harvested." The evidence burned. Without the gallery, without the specimens, it's just my word against his, and I'm legally insane. Your word alone isn't enough. But there are records, financial documents showing purchases of preservation supplies that far exceed what a normal asylum would need. Burial records that don't match death certificates. Testimony from staff members who saw things they couldn't explain. What staff members? They all think it was an accident. Dr. Webster smiled slightly. Not all of them. There's a nurse named Elizabeth Morse. She's been very helpful. Elizabeth. Sarah felt something like hope kindle in her chest, then immediately suppressed it. Hope was dangerous. Even if we gather evidence, even if people believe us, Covenant has powerful friends. Judge Blackwood, half the wealthy families in western Massachusetts. They'll protect him. Maybe. Or maybe they'll abandon him to save their own reputations. Wealthy families don't like being associated with scandal. Dr. Webster pulled a card from her bag, held it out. Think about it. I'm asking you to risk everything, I know. But if you don't, Covenant wins. He rebuilds his asylum. He restarts his collection. And the people who died, in the fire, in his gallery, they died for nothing. Sarah took the card. Dr. Harriet Webster, physician, specializing in women's nervous disorders. An address on Beacon Hill. I'll think about it, Sarah said. Don't think too long. Covenant's fundraising is going well. He could break ground on the new asylum as early as spring. Dr. Webster walked away, leaving Sarah standing on the street outside the factory, the card clutched in her hand. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the other girls snore and breathe and tried to decide what to do. Testifying against Covenant meant exposing herself, meant admitting she had been institutionalized, confirming her diagnosis of moral insanity, meant becoming public and vulnerable. She would lose her anonymity, her safety, her carefully constructed new identity. But staying silent meant Covenant continued his work, meant more women disappeared into his new asylum, meant more brains in jars, more bodies reduced to specimens, more families told their loved ones died of natural causes. Sarah thought about Margaret, dying in a boarding house bed, about Clara Hewitt, the first specimen in Covenant's collection, about the 3 men who burned because the fire spread too fast. She thought about the bracelet on her wrist. 11 knots for 11 dead. How many more knots would there be if she did nothing? At dawn, Sarah made her decision. She went to Dr. Webster's office on her next day off. The building was elegant, professional, nothing like the asylum. Dr. Webster received her in a consultation room with upholstered chairs and paintings on the walls. I'll testify, Sarah said without preamble. But I need guarantees, I need protection, and I need you to find the others, Anna, Ruth, Catherine, Hope. If I'm doing this, if I'm risking everything, we do it together. Dr. Webster nodded slowly. I've already located 2 of them. Anna Cooper is living with her sister in Providence, working as a seamstress. Hope Jennings is in a state institution in Vermont. She had a breakdown 2 months ago, couldn't maintain her independence. Sarah's heart sank. Hope had been so fragile, so damaged by the asylum. The voices had won. The others? Still searching, but Sarah, you should know, even with multiple testimonies, this will be difficult. Covenant's lawyers will attack your credibility. They'll use your diagnosis against you. They'll claim the fire destroyed your minds along with the building. I know, but we have to try. Yes, Dr. Webster agreed. We do. Over the following months, Dr. Webster built her case. She found Catherine Mills in Ohio, living under an assumed name but willing to testify. Ruth Davidson had disappeared completely. Dr. Webster feared the worst but couldn't confirm. She gathered financial records showing Covenant had purchased chemicals and preservation equipment far exceeding normal medical needs. She found burial records that didn't match death certificates, bodies supposedly interred that no gravedigger remembered burying. Most importantly, she had Elizabeth Morse. The nurse had been racked with guilt since the fire. She had left Mercy Falls, returned to Boston, and had been looking for someone who would listen to her story when Dr. Webster found her. Elizabeth could testify to what she had seen: the suspicious deaths, the late-night basement visits, the gallery with its specimens. She was a trained nurse with an unimpeachable reputation. Her testimony would carry weight that the patient's testimony alone wouldn't. In March 1878, nearly a year after the fire, Dr. Webster brought her evidence to the Massachusetts Medical Board. The hearing was held in a Boston courthouse, closed to the public due to the sensitive nature of the allegations. Covenant attended with 2 lawyers. Judge Blackwood sat in the gallery, his presence a clear statement of support. Sarah testified first. She described her admission to the asylum, the examinations, the atmosphere of fear. She described discovering Covenant's photograph of Clara Hewitt's brain, described accessing the gallery, described what she had seen there. Covenant's lawyers tore into her testimony with surgical precision. They emphasized her diagnosis. They questioned her reliability. They suggested she had imagined the gallery, that the stress of the fire had created false memories. Miss Whitmore, isn't it true you were diagnosed with moral insanity and intellectual hypertrophy? Conditions characterized by delusions and distorted perception of reality? My diagnosis was based on reading books and questioning my father's authority. That's not insanity. But Dr. Covenant, a trained physician, determined you required institutional care. Are you saying his medical judgment was wrong? I'm saying his medical judgment was convenient. I was inconvenient to my father. The asylum made me disappear. The asylum was treating you. The asylum was warehousing me until Dr. Covenant decided I was ready to be murdered and preserved. The lawyers moved on to the fire. They established that Sarah had deliberately started it. They painted her as a dangerous arsonist whose actions had killed 3 innocent men. You murdered 3 patients to cover up your escape, didn't you? I started a fire to destroy evidence of Dr. Covenant's crimes. The deaths were unintentional, but yes, I bear responsibility for them, and that weight will never leave me. The honesty seemed to surprise the lawyers. They had expected denial, not acknowledgement of guilt. Anna Cooper testified next. Then Catherine Mills. Then Elizabeth Morse, whose professional credentials and composed testimony carried the most weight. Elizabeth described finding Sarah in the asylum, being shown the gallery, seeing the preserved specimens. She described the deaths she had witnessed, the suspicious circumstances, Covenant's behavior during hydrotherapy treatments. Covenant's lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting she was emotionally unstable, had been seduced by the patient's delusions. But Elizabeth remained calm and factual, her nurse's training serving her well. The hearing lasted 3 days. At the end, the medical board retired to deliberate. Sarah sat in the courthouse hallway with the others, waiting for a verdict that might mean justice, or might mean nothing. Dr. Webster sat with them, saying little, her face composed but her hands betraying her nervousness. After 6 hours, the board returned. Their finding was carefully worded, politically calculated, and ultimately inadequate. The board finds that Dr. Silas Covenant's practices at the Mercy Falls Asylum, while highly irregular and ethically questionable, cannot be conclusively proven to constitute criminal activity due to the destruction of physical evidence in the fire of May 1877. However, given the serious nature of the allegations and the concerning testimony provided, the board recommends that Dr. Covenant's medical license be suspended pending further investigation. Additionally, the board recommends that all future asylum construction be subject to enhanced oversight and regular inspection. Suspended, not revoked, not charged with murder, just suspended pending further investigation. Covenant stood, smiled slightly, and left the courthouse with Judge Blackwood. His lawyers looked satisfied. Sarah felt the last of her hope crumble. They had testified, had exposed themselves, had risked everything, and Covenant walked free. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Webster tried to find encouraging words. It's not nothing. The suspension will make it harder for him to rebuild. The publicity will scare away some donors. We achieved something. We achieved nothing, Sarah said. He's free. He'll practice under another name, in another state. He'll continue his work, and we destroyed ourselves for nothing. Dr. Webster had no answer for that. But 6 months later, something unexpected happened. An article appeared in the Boston Globe, written by a journalist who had attended the medical board hearing. The article laid out the allegations against Covenant in detail, described the testimony, questioned why more aggressive action hadn't been taken. The article created a scandal. Other newspapers picked up the story. Medical journals began publishing pieces questioning asylum practices more broadly. Reform advocates used Covenant's case as evidence that institutions needed better oversight. Judge Blackwood, confronted with public scrutiny, quietly withdrew his support from Covenant's rebuilding plans. Other donors followed. The new asylum was never built. Covenant moved to New York, tried to establish a practice there. But the scandal had damaged his reputation. Physicians who had previously admired his research now distanced themselves. Hospitals refused him privileges. In 1882, 4 years after the medical board hearing, Silas Covenant died of a stroke in a boarding house in Albany. He was 53 years old. His obituary in the medical journals made no mention of his collection or his crimes. It simply noted that he had made contributions to the study of mental illness and had died before his research could be completed. Sarah read the obituary in the factory's common room. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, not even the closure she had hoped for. Covenant was dead, but the women in his collection were still dead too. The 3 men who burned in the fire were still dead. Margaret was still buried in an unmarked grave. Justice hadn't been served. At best, further injustice had been prevented. It wasn't the same thing. Sarah folded the newspaper and went back to work. The years passed. Sarah remained in Boston, working in garment factories, eventually becoming a forewoman herself. She never married, never had children, never spoke about the asylum to anyone except, occasionally, in brief letters to Dr. Webster, who became something like a friend. Anna Cooper opened a small shop in Providence, selling handmade lace. She wrote to Sarah once a year, brief notes about her life that never mentioned the asylum directly, but carried the weight of shared experience in every line. Catherine Mills died in Ohio in 1885 of pneumonia. Her cousin sent word to Dr. Webster, who passed it on to Sarah. Ruth Davidson was never found. Sarah hoped she was alive somewhere, hoped she had escaped and survived. But she never knew for certain. Hope Jennings died in the Vermont institution in 1883. The voices had never stopped. Dr. Webster visited her before the end. Hope's last words, according to the doctor, were, "Tell Sarah the ones in the jars stopped screaming. Tell her they're quiet now." Sarah wore the bracelet Margaret had made, 11 knots for 11 dead, until the threads finally disintegrated in 1890. By then, she had committed every knot to memory, every name, every face. She died in 1903 at the age of 47. A stroke, like Covenant, though Sarah's came while she was working. She collapsed at her sewing machine and was dead before anyone could fetch a doctor. Her few possessions were distributed among the other factory workers. There wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books, letters from Anna Cooper and Dr. Webster. Nothing that suggested the extraordinary and terrible things she had experienced. The building that had housed the Mercy Falls Asylum was never rebuilt. The land was sold, subdivided, eventually developed into residential housing. By 1920, no physical trace of the asylum remained. But the story persisted, in whispered conversations among former patients who had survived the fire, in medical ethics discussions about the dangers of unchecked institutional power, in the memories of a few people who had known Sarah Whitmore and the others who had heard fragments of what really happened. Dr. Harriet Webster published a book in 1895, The Treatment of Female Patients in Mental Institutions, A Call for Reform. The book never mentioned Covenant or the Mercy Falls Asylum by name, but anyone familiar with the case could read between the lines. The book sparked conversations about asylum reform, patient rights, medical ethics. Small changes began to happen. Not enough, never enough, but something. Elizabeth Morse became a nursing instructor, training young nurses in patient advocacy and ethical care. She never married, never spoke publicly about the asylum. But her students remembered her intensity when she discussed patient rights, the fire in her eyes when she insisted that medical authority must always be questioned. The location where the asylum once stood became, over the decades, just another neighborhood. Families moved in, children played in yards that had once been asylum grounds. No one knew what had happened there. Except sometimes, according to local stories, people would find things in their gardens. Fragments of glass bottles, pieces of metal instruments. Once, during an excavation for a basement renovation in 1957, workers uncovered a section of stone wall that had been part of the asylum's foundation. In a sealed compartment behind the stones, they found a glass jar. The jar was empty, its preservative fluids long since evaporated. But the label was still legible, written in faded ink. Subject CH, female, age 29, melancholia. Clara Hewitt, the first specimen. Somehow preserved through fire, hidden in the foundation, surviving when everything else had been destroyed. The workers didn't know what they had found. They threw the jar away with the other construction debris. But the jar's existence proved something Sarah had always believed, that even the most thorough destruction leaves traces, that the dead don't disappear completely, that every atrocity, no matter how carefully hidden, eventually surfaces in some form. The story of the Mercy Falls Asylum and Dr. Silas Covenant's collection of the mad wasn't taught in medical schools, wasn't recorded in official histories, wasn't acknowledged by the institutions that had allowed it to happen, but it existed in memories and whispers, in the nightmares of survivors, in the empty spaces where names should have been recorded but weren't, and in a bracelet of knotted threads that Sarah Whitmore wore for 13 years, carrying the weight of 11 dead, and the knowledge that she had survived, and that survival itself was a form of testimony, a refusal to let the victims be forgotten completely. The world moved on. Asylums continued operating, though with gradually improving oversight. Medical ethics evolved, though slowly and incompletely. Women gradually gained more rights, more autonomy, more ability to resist being disappeared into institutions. But some stories remain as warnings, reminders that cruelty disguised as science, atrocity disguised as treatment, can happen anywhere authority goes unchecked and vulnerable people are deemed disposable. The Mercy Falls Asylum burned in 1877. Dr. Silas Covenant died in 1882. Sarah Whitmore died in 1903. But the dead in the jars, Clara Hewitt, William Chase, and all the others whose brains floated in Covenant's gallery, they remain. Not in physical form, but in the historical record that finally, incompletely, acknowledged what was done to them. And maybe that acknowledgement, inadequate as it is, serves as a kind of justice, a refusal to let them be completely erased, a recognition that they existed, they mattered, they deserved better than what was done to them. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's something. And sometimes, in a world that so often forgets the vulnerable and the victimized, something is all we have.